To begin tonight's event, we've asked all of our esteemed panelists to offer a brief introduction to their own work and the ways in which their work engages generic hybridity, which is a sort of maybe unnecessarily complex way of saying that it doesn't conform to our expectations around genre. So I'd like to just turn to them before we begin the conversation and let them introduce you to their writing. So I'm not sure if someone wants to begin or if we have a presentation queued up.
Sure, I'll begin. So I think the most useful thing for me to do at this point is to talk about a whole number of my projects so you get a sense of the range of things I work on. You can turn the sound off. I'm just going to leave this playing in the background while I talk a little bit about my various works. These are from the Skin project that you heard mentioned, and I'll tell you about that first. I launched it in 2003 in the form of a call for participants in Cabinet Magazine, people who would come forward to have one word of a short story of mine tattooed on their body, where was up to them, how big was up to them, but I would assign them the word and they wouldn't know beforehand what word that was going to be, although of course they could turn it down once they saw it. There are 2,095 words in the project, and the story is intended to be published in no other way, so the tattooing is the publication. And much to my surprise, after launching this project, I got an extraordinary number of volunteers, thousands and thousands of volunteers. I probably have 20,000 emails from people who would like to participate in my files at this point. And let's see. I think a couple of things I want to point out about the project. One is that it's a ceaselessly rearrangeable story because its participants are walking around in the world. They're having random encounters with strangers and with each other. Sometimes their tattoos are visible, sometimes they aren't. So there's a sort of transient readership that will get a glimpse, say, of one word totally out of context and maybe suspect that it's part of a larger story but not know what that story is. Well, a couple of my participants have already died, and that's something that I make provision for in the project itself, actually, because the subtitle of the work is a mortal work of art. And part of my intention is that it eventually erase itself entirely from the world. So it edits itself over time, essentially, as people drop out. And since I haven't yet finished publishing the work, and several of my participants have already died, that means it never will exist complete in the world in its original intended form. So it's this evolving, wandering, collective, patchworked kind of story. The bodies form a kind of monstrous collective body that never will come together in one space. And I guess to me that speaks to my understanding of language itself as this recombinant collection of fragments that, for me, are very physical. And that brings me to my very first published work called Patchwork Girl, which is a hypertext that I wrote in 1995, so way before I had even been on the internet for the first time. But I was at Brown University and introduced to the idea of writing texts that were meant to be read on the computer and in a network format rather than in a linear way. And so in response to this idea, I wrote this sort of a novel about a female Frankenstein monster. The female the female monster that, in fact, in Mary Shelley's novel, the scientist starts to create as a mate for his monster and then destroys. In my version, she is made and speaks for herself in one part of the novel, but I also engage in kind of theoretical meditations on the nature of text and fiction, the patchworkiness of identity as well as of literature. And parts of that hypertext are also literally patchworked out of quotes from different sources. It also includes visual images. But you can see there's a lineage there between this monstrous composite body of the Frankenstein monster text and the composite body of my skin project. I'm going to skip a number of projects to tell you about the novel I finished most recently, which is tentatively titled Papers from the Sybil Joines Vocational School for Ghost Speakers and Hearing Mouth Children, which is it's about a fictional school where children with speech impediments are taught to channel the dead. And in addition to a very gothic, melodramatic narrative with ghosts, as you might expect, and murders, there is also this strong fake nonfiction vein where I explain the physics of channeling the dead and visiting the land of the dead. I've made artifacts that purport to be from the land of the dead. I've made maps and diagrams and sound files, sound recordings. So this is a very multimedia object, roughly defined, that I'm calling a novel, but that sort of leaks into all sorts of different disciplines. And then finally, one last project is one that I have not yet launched, but seems important to talk about in this context, which is called Project for Polluted Waterway. It was intended to be installed around the Gowanus Canal. And it includes two stories about a brother and sister, one of which was meant to be installed on, both of which were meant to be installed on plaques along the length of the Gowanus, but are to be read in different directions depending on which way the tide is flowing. And then in addition, there is a list of prompts of things you might see while, say, canoeing on the Gowanus, like a dead rat. And with each of those prompts is associated a short text that's more like in the vein of prose poetry, that sort of is meant to be read in the narrative at the point you encounter that prompt. So the narrative that you'll find is unpredictably interrupted by these specific inclusions that depend on what you yourself have encountered on your trip down the canal. So it's site-specific, but it's also sort of tide-specific and occasion-specific. And with that, I think I'll shut up. So.
Should I just hand the mic down?
You have one.
Oh, that's true. I didn't know if I wanted to use the standing mic. I was sort of jealous of Shelley's command of the mic, so I'll use the mic as well. Hi, I'm David Shields, and I think after Shelley's presentation, I fear that my presentation might be a little pedestrian, no canoeing rats or anything like that. But I'll tell you a little bit about the arc of my writing life that brought me here. In many ways, in genuflection to David Markson. I in my 20s and early to mid 30s, I wrote 3 increasingly unconventional novels, but books that were recognizably novels. A very traditional novel that Steve Erickson, in one review, called almost a parody of the conventional novel. And I'm thinking we're having it reissue. We're thinking of putting that on the cover. And then a second novel that I think is a more interesting book, but a book called Dead Languages, and it's sort of a meditation upon language and stuttering, to call back to Shelley's project, but it's also recognizably a relatively conventional Bildungsroman, a growing up novel. Then a third book called Handbook for Drowning, a novel in stories, which slips and slides in between genres. Some pieces feel pretty essayistic, some feel rather collage-like, some feel like kind of shockingly conventional stories, almost parodies of the conventional short story. But it sort of comes together, I hope, into a book of thematically linked stories. And then I was trying to write my fourth book, what I thought was a novel that I was aware of being influenced by, say, Milan Kundera's Unbearable Lightness of Being and Don DeLillo's White Noise. I wanted to write a book about a couple, maybe a husband and wife or boyfriend and girlfriend, who judge themselves and each other by the ersatz standards of American mass culture. And for the life of me, I just could not write that book. So much so that in desperation, I don't know if this actually happened or whether I want to think it happened. I think I offered a student money to buy some paragraphs of hers that were the perfect paragraphs. I don't know if I actually did that. If that's actionable, then it didn't happen. If it is actionable. Anyway, I got to the point of desperation that I was even thinking of such things, where a student was sort of writing the paragraphs about a fictional couple obsessed with Mary Tyler Moore that I wanted to be writing. So at that point, I had hit the proverbial wall, and I had to figure out what to do with my writing life. And luckily, I started watching a lot of self-reflexive documentary movies with my colleague, the poet Heather McHugh. I started people like Ross McElway, Frederick Weissman, above all, Errol Morris, many others, watching a lot and listening to a lot of performance art, stand-up comedy, monologue, Spalding Gray, Rick Reynolds, Sandra Bernard, and reading a lot of anthropological autobiography. The term is George W.S. Troe's term. George Troe is among the writers who really influenced me, certainly Wayne Koestenbaum, and Renata Adler, quite a lot. And also, I mean, shortly after that, David Markson. And all of these writers were reminding me of the truth of certain wisdom spoken by people like V.S. Naipaul, who says, if you want to write seriously, you have to be willing to break the forms. Or Walter Benjamin, who said, this is really my mantra, you know, all serious works of literature either invent a genre or dissolve one. Or J.M. Coetzee in Summerland, who speaks beautifully about implicitly finding himself not a great writer because he, quote, never deformed the medium in order to say what only he could say. These became my North Stars. I knew how bored I was, for whatever reason, with the conventional pacing, plotting, setting, scene setting, backstorying, dialogue. Basically, I wasn't that great at it. And I was interested hugely, you know, creeping ADD in compression, in concision, in velocity. I was interested in placing myself in harm's way in the work as the performing artist and stand-up comedians and self-reflexive documentary filmmakers did. I was hugely interested in the hybridization of genre so you could no longer tell what floor of the department store you're on. Is this women's lingerie? Is this men's sporting goods? Where are we? To me, a work is exciting precisely when you can't know exactly what space you're occupying. Is this confession? Is this stand-up comedy? Is this cultural rant? Is this fiction? Is this diary entry? So many of the books I most love of late feel that they are, the works are rotating out toward a much larger metaphor and meaning, but they look almost improvisational, thrown off, tossed off. They have a weird user-friendliness about them. I think of, say, any number of books. Certainly, two books of Markson's I particularly love are This Is Not a Novel, which looks like a bag of quotations, but is a searing meditation, an unbelievably rigorously focused meditation on precisely the relationship between life and death and art, and what consolation, if any, is it that you're Sophocles and 2,300 years ago you wrote Oedipus, you're still dead. What possible value is it that we're still reading Sophocles to Sophocles? So I was hugely, what would you call it? What's the term? Turbocharged by all of these works. McAwee, Renata Adler, Trow, David Markson. And it's terribly important to emphasize in Markson, for instance, to me the best book I've read on 9/11 is Markson's Vanishing Point. He barely mentions it, but it's the smartest book I've read. It has that beautiful cover. Is it Ross Bleecker on the cover? Do you remember the cover of the original paperback of Vanishing Point? It seems to evoke the falling man from 9/11. And it's terribly important to me that in all, as I like to say, collage is not a refuge for the compositionally disabled. A lot of people think a collage work, a la, say, whether it's Maggie Nelson, Sarah Manguso, Amy Fusselman, Simon Gray, Leonard Michaels, Spalding Gray, David Markson, that the works are a kind of loose baggage of coins. But in the very best hands, collage is an increasingly rigorous investigation of its materials. And it goes anywhere it possibly wants, into any materials, as long as it's putting increasing pressure on the investigation. A couple other features of the works that I really love is, some of this is implied, they're hybrid, they're lyric rather than narrative. The momentum of the work doesn't derive from the exfoliation of plot, but the investigation of theme. It tends to sort of jump the tracks, as, say, Ross McAwee Sherman's March does. It starts out being a biographical film about General William Tecumseh Sherman, and winds up being about the toxic masculinity of the male gaze. You would never have figured out how the film got there. I sort of like to think of these works as sort of postmodernism with a human face. They're full of trickery and self-consciousness and self-reflexivity, but they're always serving quite serious human investigative needs. We're always reading the parts discreetly, but they're always part of a larger whole. The whole, how does the line go? The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. As we were talking earlier, Wayne was saying, well, there's just this line in Markson where Markson just says Goethe. There's just that one line. But I would argue that the book only works if that is part of a much larger and considered investigation. Picasso says a great painting comes together, just barely. And so many of these works, to me, pivot on that particular comma. These works come together just barely. And, if they come together too obliquely, the reader is frustrated as having just read a kind of loose assemblage. If the works come together too obviously, the reader feels patronized. And so much of what I love about this kind of work is that it demands a very attentive reader who's paying attention to something more than turning pages and making exciting connections between seemingly disparate things, and thereby building a bridge across the abyss of human loneliness, nothing less. These works tend to be animated by personal, cultural, and sort of human crises. The books of Markson's that I like the best sort of pivot on a kind of psychic or human or mortal crux. Markson's dying, Markson's worrying a particular philosophical problem. A couple of last points. They tend to be notational, written in a sort of hieroglyphic poetry where a lot of the gaps aren't filled in. You know, he might just say Goethe, and then, you know, maybe that line pops, maybe it doesn't, but if Markson is working really well, it's part of a much larger thematic matrix. And as I like to say, all of my works are short, collaborative, and plagiarized. And a lot of what I like about Markson is the way that he moves in and out of other texts. He doesn't, you know, there's quotation, there's paraphrase, there's citation. And just as a sort of final footnote, sort of bizarrely, as wildly as Markson moves in and out of quotation and paraphrase, he was quite upset at me. I had a sort of long postcard correspondence with him the last several years of his life, and he got very mad at my, of course, appropriation of some lines of his in my book Reality Hunger. And, you know, physician, hail thyself. Thank you.
I'm going to show you a little video, an example of my work in a second, so you'll see what the work is like. But I think of a book as a place where I can go to think, and I can do research and just investigate and learn something, because I find that pleasurable. So I pick out areas of investigation that I'm interested in. Usually I know nothing about it at the beginning, but it sounds good to me. And so with this last one, it's in 3 parts, and one part is Dostoevsky and his book, The Idiot. I also really enjoy interacting with another work. So to live with The Idiot for a number of years, for me, was amazing. So the book, the new one, has Venice, because I thought that would be interesting, and the Venetian plague of 1557, and Dostoevsky. And oddly enough, like, these things come together. In my previous book, A Monster's Notes, I had Mary Shelley and the monster, but I also managed to segue into the middle of the book the great Chinese classic, The Dream of the Red Chamber, which was amazing to read. In translation, 4,000 pages. Amazing book. But so, you know, a site of thinking, Beckett said, to find a form to accommodate the shape of the mess, that is the task of the artist now. And so, you know, that's an interesting question, I think, to pose to oneself as a writer. You go and you sort of fly by the seat of your pants. You know, I don't know what the book's going to look like. I just know what I want to think about. And I don't even take for granted what a page is going to look like. You know, a page might have a word, a sentence. It might be full. It might be broken in certain ways. I've come to think, belatedly, that the internet has influenced the form of my work, in that the work probably has a web-like kind of structure. You go from link to link to link, and there are a lot of leaps, but somehow there are themes, feelings, ideas that are unifying it. So I don't want to take up too much time talking, since I'm going to show this little video, or Rosie is, if she's there. Where is Rosie? There. So you'll get a sense of what some of the work at least sounds like. The notebook was kept by a patient on the old hospital island of San Servolo. Pasted in among his pages were notes from another patient who suffered from a rare genetic illness found in Venice. First, there's difficulty falling asleep, and then eventually the afflicted can't sleep at all. Often there are hallucinations. Her eyes had blurred, and she'd asked him to read from Dostoevsky's great novel, The Idiot. Like him, Dostoevsky and his novel's main character, Prince Mishkin, were epileptics. As he read and she listened, she began to believe at times that she was Dostoevsky,
then Mishkin, or sometimes a mixture of both of them and herself. How could I possibly accept that the woman being read to had the same illness as the one across the ocean who had sent me? I grew dizzy again, but the next day continued reading. The less I sleep, the more I need the books I can no longer read. I believe you can help me. How can I explain why I need this so badly? The soul of another is a dark place, Prince Mishkin thinks to himself as he walks in his own darkness. And what chaos is found there. And the narrator says, strange facts are before us in abundance, but far from making things clearer, they obscure every explanation. In these hours when you're not here, sometimes Dostoevsky's life comes back to me. I don't know why. He spent 4 years in a prison camp. Did you know this? I try to think of what it did to him, what it took from his mind, from his body, what it gave. Why do I remember so exactly when so much else is blurring? After his arrest, he was kept in solitary confinement for 7 months, his cell window covered with an oily paste to prevent any daylight seeping through. One morning he was ordered to dress, then taken to Semyonov Square, where a firing squad would carry out his execution. But at the last minute he was told he'd be sent to Siberia instead. He was sent to the prison camp in Omsk. He was allowed one letter. Dear brother, today we were taken to Semyonov Square, where we were read the death sentence, then allowed to kiss the cross, and given our white death shirts to put on. I was the 6th in line for execution, standing in the 2nd row, and had no more than a few minutes left to live. Then suddenly a retreat was sounded. It was announced that His Imperial Majesty was granting us our lives. Apparently, this had been planned all along. I don't remember if you came to read to me last night. Maybe in this darkness you can't find me. My eyes blur, but this blurring is inside me also. Am I in Omsk or on an island off of Venice? And what if there's a patient hidden chaos within even the most tender seeming word, even the most kind, most calming? I wish that I could ask you, I wish that I could see your lighted window. But now I'm cold again. 9 years have passed and I've finished out my sentence. The doctors in Petersburg confirm my illness is epilepsy and that I will never get well. They can't keep my brain from catching fire or help protect the scattered words inside me. And the universe spinning and spinning. Black holes, dark matter. Dear Mikhail, dear Apollon, dear Sonechka, I don't want to fall, but I will fall. I've left Petersburg for Europe to consult specialists in Switzerland and France as my seizures are increasing. Today in Basel, I'm in the museum looking at Holbein's Dead Christ, and I feel I'm falling, but for once I keep looking and don't fall. The eyes are dull, half open, the face a nauseous blue-green, the skin on the verge of decomposing, the mouth rigid, unclosed. There is not one hint of consolation. Who would want to sit beside this corpse? You can almost smell it rotting. Nothing else on the canvas but these two horizontal forms, stone slab, brutalized, hurt body. The slab so much easier to look at than the other. Dear Sonechka, I am at work on a new book. I want it to be as uncompromising as Holbein's Dead Christ. I think it is impossible to know what goodness is until it is reduced to complete powerlessness. There is a prince I have to hurt in order to reveal his goodness, in order to begin to know him. I don't know if I can do this. I am tired of beautiful words. I never liked them.
But by the way, when Dostoevsky did go to look at Holbein's Dead Christ, he had he had epilepsy, and so his wife was always worried about him. But the Holbein was up high, and so he dragged over a chair, and he got up on the chair, and his wife was terrified because it was against the rules of the museum, but also that he could fall, and he started to sway. And then he just focused on this painting that was very important to the idiot, and went on, and didn't get caught, didn't get kicked out of the museum. Your turn.
I'm in a trance. Okay, loved hearing all of that. It put me in a certain a readerly posture rather than a writerly posture. So I have to remember that now I'm for a minute the writer, not the reader. I will say a few extemporaneous words. I will read a little bit about how I write, and then I will briefly, extemporaneously sketch out what I'm writing right now. So I began childhood as a pianist, but then I went to college and I studied English, and I became a fiction writer the way an 18-year-old becomes a fiction writer. But I discovered a kind of interior sanctuary by doing it. It really constituted me as a subject to write fiction. And I went to graduate school to study fiction writing at Johns Hopkins, and I wrote a book of short stories, and then that was it for fiction. For various reasons. Maybe it was the process of getting an MFA in it. And I decided I had always preferred reading poetry, and that I wanted to be a poet, and I had always been a poet in prose. And so I reinvented myself as a writer of essentially narrative poems. Then I went to graduate school in English to become a critic and an academic, which I am, and discovered that writing critical prose was also an expressive act. I largely discovered this by myself, not in the classes I took, as wonderful as they were. My dissertation itself was not an expressive work, except covertly. But after I finished graduate school and was still writing and publishing poetry, though not fiction, I began to write critical prose in a way that brought into it the fiction writing I had done and the poetry I continued to do. And my life since then has been, my aesthetic life has been since then a series of attempts or experiments to bring more and more into unity these expressive threads, including music. So I will speak now, or read a little bit, things I do when I write so-called critical prose, meaning nonfiction. Things I do that make it not critical prose, and that make it novelistic or poetic. I interrupt my critical prose with autobiographical interludes and asides. I interrupt my critical prose with digressions. I interrupt the prose by expanding dependent clauses and by treating parenthetical grammatical elements as independent narrative elements, affording me freedom from the expository restraints of the sentence as a whole. In other words, I declare oasis within the sentence, within the parenthetical elements, and that they mutiny. I use chants or so-called Oulipian, referring to the literary movement Oulipo, that believed in fixed constraints for fiction writing. I employ these elements in my critical prose to divert the argument and derail the content. I atomize the structure of my prose by writing in numbered fragments or in flush-left paragraphs separated by asterisks. You would call it technically parataxis, which just means that there's no connective tissue and it's just this and then that and then this and then that. Parataxis, an ugly word for a liberating practice. I create a fictional aura within my critical prose by developing a narrative persona who is the investigator, and I exaggerate my own obsessive qualities by creating the voice. I use the I in my critical prose is not me, but a fictional persona of an obsessive interpreter. And I have developed this persona, which is not exactly me, but this elaborator or interrupter or trickster. In one book project, Hotel Theory, I went to the greatest extremes by dividing the book into two parallel columns in different typefaces. The column on the left was Hotel Theory, and it was a series of critical ruminations on the poetics of hotels, itself written in a somewhat fictional voice, though ostensibly theory. And then the right-hand column, running concurrently but never conversing with the left-hand column, I wrote what I called a dime novel, meaning kind of trashy, but in a retro way. But to make it work for me, I used a chance device or a constraint. I omitted all uses of the articles a, an, and the, so that there were different kinds of stringencies or exclusions operating in both columns. In my critical prose, I heighten effects of rhythm and sound to bring out physicality and uncertainty. I use repetition in critical prose to intensify its tone of wishfulness, urgency, and unreliability. I increase the vertigo in my prose by omitting any helpful adverb-like devices that establish continuity. Long ago gave them up. Words like nonetheless, on the other hand, in contrast, or therefore. Personally, I approach each writing project as if it were taking place in my heart within the neighbor genre. When I wrote a critical book on opera, The Queen's Throat, in 1993, I really pretended I was writing a novel. Not just like slightly pretended. I was reading the Mambo King's book by Oscar Huelos. I was reading Manuel Puig. I was reading a lot of rhapsodic novels, and I just had pretended it's a novel. Just keep going, like the sense of speed. When I'm writing a poem, I often pretend it's a novel. The novel is the desired zone. I rarely occupy it. But when I have written a novel, I usually pretend it's a poem. And when I write an essay, I sometimes write it literally in poetic lines, and then before I turn it back into prose by removing the line breaks. Just a couple more of these devices. Sometimes I write either fictional or non-fictional prose in one chunk without paragraph breaks, because it creates a certain claustrophobia, but a certain kind of intense holding environment, and it's kind of, I think, a tribute to the prose poems of the Romantics and of the symbolists, Baudelaire and Rimbaud, where you never get a break, and you're always within this consciousness that you could pejoratively call solipsistic, but that's actually fun to be in. It's an echo chamber, and that's the effect of not having paragraph breaks. Sometimes, though, I write essays or other things in one-sentence paragraphs. And I learned this from Ivy Compton Burnett, a fiction writer, and from Gertrude Stein, just a poet, everything. That the constant interruptions of the paragraph, the back and forth, create a kind of an atmosphere somewhere between screwball comedy and a stately gavotte or something, but that the rhythm overstages the content, which is very important to me. Okay, so finally, what I'm working on now that sort of, that brings all these things together, I'm writing a trance trilogy, which comes from my notebooks. I've always kept a journal all my life, and I decided in 2012 that the journal would be published, and that I would write in a very automatic writing style in notebooks. The notebooks would be so thin that there would be essentially line breaks, and then when I would type them up, I would then harvest from this mass aphoristic stanzas. And the first volume is called the Pink Trance Notebooks. The second volume is coming out next year and is called Camp Marmalade. And I've now done all the notebooks for the third volume. I'm working on a book of short fictions inspired by works of art. These are usually commissioned essays. An artist says, please write about my work, and I say, I will probably not describe your work in it. If you don't mind that kind of liberty, I would love to collaborate with you by responding in a parable to your work. More so even in the old days when I always veered away from what I was supposed to be talking about. And now they're really fictions. I'm also writing actual poems, and I know they're poems because I type them on a typewriter. And that tells me that they're poems, because they're slow, it's a headspace that comes from the typewriter. And then finally, a book of essays, most of them in poetic or fictional-like guises. Some of them are Chicken with Hoisin Sauce, Of Smells, My New Glasses, Corpse Pose, Rauschenberg's Squeegee. The last thing I'll say is that I have developed this thing called my lounge act, where I play the piano and do sort of a speak-sing, Sprechstimme, improvisational monologues while I play the piano, usually scripted pieces by like Chopin or Scriabin. And it was that activity that actually brought me back to writing parable-like fiction and poems again, because I realized when I was just improvising at the piano, I understood ABA structure. I understood narrative, the simplest kind of narrative. And I feel at the moment very unified.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, everyone. And just to say, if anyone has questions about the panelists' work, there'll be time for you to pose those at the end of the conversation, so please hold on to those. And I hope the panelists will also speak about their work further in the answers that they give. So I have a question for all of you that, well, it's a kind of problem that I have that I was hoping that you might be able to help me out with. Because when we come to the matter of genre, particularly around the novel, we're faced with the fact that the novel has always been a kind of genre agnostic entity, or it's been a literary space in which you got to include things that are not, strictly speaking, literary, like, I don't know, menus, like tips for how to do things. I'm sure you can think of many other examples. I'm not sure why those are the two that come to mind so pressingly right now. And I'm curious if we are in a moment right now where it's not enough to merely write a novel that includes items from other disciplines and ways of doing things than the literary sphere, but that one must also say, following Markson, this is not a novel in some way, that there's something really key about working in that fashion.
This is sort of, we could all jump in. you want to go? I mean,
No, you go.
This is kind of, I've been thinking about this question pretty obsessively the last 20 years, as we all have. I mean, these are my questions that I'm as baffled by them as you are. I don't pretend to have any answers, but you know, we're obsessed with reality now because we experience hardly any in our actual lives. That's the key move to me, that that for certain kinds of sensibility, certain kinds of intelligence, certain kinds of imagination, the, what would you call it, naively sincerely novelistic gesture seems to belong to something like the ancient past. To me, it's not true for probably most people in this room, but certainly David Markson's career is instructive. He wrote, as probably most people know, some relatively conventional kind of detective novels. Mm-hmm. And I'm even not, I mean, a lot of my fellow panelists will disagree with it. I'm not a big fan of Wittgenstein's Mistress. That's a book that a lot of people like. That book still retains a lot of the claws, CLAWS, of conventional fiction. And it's really the last 4 books, for me, Vanishing Point, This Is Not a Novel, Reader's Block, and the last novel in which Markson really understands that genre is a minimum security prison. Break out. That's my little rant.
Well, I was never in the prison because I wrote books of poems for many years, and so this is not a novel. It's not something, I love Markson's work, but it's not something that I deeply felt I was struggling with. The only thing that happened to me was I started writing something, and it didn't belong anywhere, and I wasn't calling it anything. And actually, when I finished 520 pages later, and gave it to my editor then at Knopf, who didn't answer me for 9 months, we met in a coffee shop, and she said, "What is it?" And I said, "It is itself." But you know, they don't sell things based on itself. And actually, when I was teaching a few weeks ago, Michael Ondaatje's The Collected Works of Billy the Kid, which is a good book, you know, one of his early books. It's a vintage paperback, so on the back it's called fiction. And then you go to the copyright page, the ISBN is poetry. You know, he wrote it as a book of poems, but then when he got famous and Vintage was reissuing it, how do you label it? How do you make more money off it? And there's marketing involved in this stuff too. I think one nice thing about the internet is you don't have little parts of the bookstore where it's like, this is the fiction, this is the poetry, and everything's separated. I mean, it does strike me, many of us don't like to separate people that way. Why are we so anxious to separate books that way? Or in MFA programs, you're in the poetry or you're in the fiction, or this. It's very rigid to me, and I just don't know that that's how human thinking works, which is what concerns me the most. Not that something is not something so much. I can see if you came out, were trained as a novelist or started writing as a novelist, but just the whole idea. I mean, labels are oppressive.
I'm going to frame my answer with a defense of Wittgenstein's Mistress, because what I'm most interested in general, I think, in fiction and in that book in particular, is the way it slips out of your grasp in regard to genre. It presents itself as a novel. It engages you in a novelistic way in a narrative with something at stake in the conventional sense.
Sure.
But it frays into what feels like pure meditation, philosophy, nonfiction. And that ambiguity puts us in, I think, exactly the sort of space you were arguing for yourself, the space of not knowing exactly where you are. And I think even though my work often sort of verges in other people's eyes on art or performance or something something other than, certainly something other than conventional fiction, it's always been important to me to continue to place it in relation to conventional fiction, maybe precisely because I think conventional fiction is such a rigid form, so narrowly defined. And I'm, on the one hand, interested in breaking open those constraints and redefining fiction, and on the other, in exploiting the expectations that they arouse in the readership of a familiar kind of experience. So people go into what is presented as a novel with the expectations that they're going to get a certain kind of gratification out of it. And I think that sets up the reader really nicely for disappointment, a disappointment that for me is revelatory. I'm interested in giving people experiences that they don't know what to do with and don't understand. And I think starting from thinking you know where you are is actually quite a good place to be, to have the rug pulled out from under you.
That is really beautiful, Shelley. I'm going to try Wittgenstein's Mistress one more time after that. Thank you.
I like all of, actually I haven't read Markson's detective novels, though I own them, but I like Wittgenstein's Mistress, but it's my least favorite of. I want to speak about three kinds of spell or enchantment that I fall under as a reader that seem to me, as much as I'm an advocate of genre loosening, they do correspond to the three genres of fiction, poetry, and something like nonfiction. The spell that I fall under when I read poetry, particularly difficult or contemporary poetry, but also poetry from the past, is into a kind of plastic relation to, or sculptural relationship to the whole body of language, particularly the English language in which I'm primarily reading, where I literally am kind of molding and surfing and being surfed by a pool of words that I'm not following the senses of semantically, syntactically, but that the words are like colors or shapes. It's like a kind of like a Kandinsky, 1913 Kandinsky painting where there's a whole field of linguistic stimulations. And I love that state. And it's where I don't understand if people say I don't understand poetry, because there is nothing to understand. It's a series of local titillations. There are sometimes other things going on too, but it's the language getting at you with all of its 1,000 fingers. And it's really fun just to open the book, move through it. Okay, fiction. I miss the trance of fiction. It's harder for me to enter it, but I can think it's that feeling of unknowing is typified by the great moments in Henry James's novels where a character has received some intelligence and there is a moment of abeyance of the plot, and where the person is maybe going for a stroll or on a ride, and is staring into space essentially, and that there is a kind of deep meditative hush that falls over you. You're identified with the character, and you're in this, but you're staring. It's a kind of blankness, though it's taking place within a fictional web, and those are really uncanny moments. You have to. And the third is, I would say, the space I mostly live in as a reader, in a sense, is the investigative and autobiographical, biographical spell. And that can be, I'm reading a biography of Barbra Streisand, which I recently did, and I'm reading the words, but I'm reimagining her life as told, and I'm in a space that is essentially fictional because I'm picturing things with a depth and vigor that is not reflected in the prose I'm reading. It's not telling me what those rooms were like, but I'm in it and I'm kind of fishing for it. But I'm also, an analogous space would be that I'm reading, say, an essay by Susan Sontag, and I'm in a double space where I'm with her investigative mind looking at the phenomenon, but then I'm investigating her mind and her subjectivity through her sentences. And with reading nonfiction, I'm always doing that double thing, or often doing that double thing. I think those three spells are very linked, and I think that any spell you fall under as a reader is a good spell.
Well, it sounds like we have here among our panelists different relationships to the idea of genre as something that is can be a conservative force, can be something to kind of push off of in one's work. And I wanted to say I do hear more and more, and I'm also open to this idea being contested, that we are in a time in which genre is more changeful than has been the case in the past. I don't know if everyone agrees with that. That's, whatever. But I'm gonna start with that as a proposition. And there are two main rationales that I hear for this, and I will share both of them with you now. One of them has to do with media and how it is that people consume text, on what sorts of time scales, where online, and how, and so forth, and the sort of leveling of text and image online. That's the first story about why literary genre is newly sort of unstable. The second story has to do with a sense that it's not just how we read and where we read that's causing this instability, but that there's a more pervasive instability within everyday life, that people experience new kinds of, to use a word that's become cliched, precarity, with respect to employment and intimacy. Critics who have written about this in terms of fiction and poetry include people like Lauren Berlant and C.N. Nye. And I'm curious for the panelists if you find resonance in either one of those accounts about the instability of genre, or if you would offer other rationales.
Shall we start with Wayne?
Well, just very briefly, I'll say that it's interesting for me as a daily reader of the New York Times to notice how, we don't have to get too political or anything, but just to say that certainly the voice of the New York Times has changed radically in the last 4 months. And in my lifetime of reading, my adult lifetime of reading the New York Times, that's a signal event, I think a beneficial and necessary event, but it reflects not a kind of anarchic, doomsday collapse of the genres or anything, but a realization of the core nature of reporting and investigation, as well as taking responsibility for that there is a person behind the reporting, that there is an ethical agenda. And that's not being biased. It's called, however you wish to put it, I think that what we're seeing happening in the all kinds of precariousness, the way the voice of the broadcaster or the announcer from Fox News, the New York Times, whatever you say, that there's we're all thinking anew about objectivity, bias, clarity. Those are very potent topics today.
You talk about rearranging. Did you see that the Times dropped its masthead today for the first time? They redesigned.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a book that I did a year and a half ago called War is Beautiful, the New York Times Pictorial Guide to the Glamour of Armed Conflict, which is a critique of New York Times front page war photography. And it calls for exactly the thing that Wayne is saying the Times has done, which indeed the Times has done, which is to place the paper in a European continuum, say, look at 12 UK newspapers, they exist on a clear spectrum of political perspective. In part, I don't pretend that the Times necessarily changed because of my book, although they did file a lawsuit against the book, so they were fully aware of it. But I think that Wayne's metaphor is really a powerful one, that if as iconographic an institution as the Times is owning its own subjective voice in a staggering way that I totally agree is unheard of in our lifetime, it suggests an emptying out of that mission control authority in religion, in family, in gender, in genre, in paper of record at all. There's a great essay on all of this written 60 years ago by Alain Robbe-Grillet called Notes for a New Novel, in which he explains beautifully, it was really the progenitor of my book Reality Hunger in many ways, where he talks quite powerfully how, say, family and one's legacy mattered to, say, inhabitants of Balzac's early 19th century France. That one took, say, a horse to market and one lived a very slow-paced life in which, and that where one lived and who one's ancestors were mattered hugely. That this was, you know, obviously pre-Freud, pre-atom bomb, pre-Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, pre-structuralism, and that the works of art that we create should reflect the pace and philosophy of our time, that relatively few working American writers have an overt belief in a deistic being, and yet many of the most acclaimed works of so-called fiction are odes to the unity of the universe, when the writer is very unlikely to have a belief in an ordering principle of the universe. So as time and place and space and relativity and God and psychology change, the works of art that we demand of our culture need to change. Do we look in visual art for a recreation of the Chartres Cathedral, in painting, in music? Are we recomposing Beethoven's symphony? No, but there is a funny oddity to the rear guard, in a way, of literature, because it has interesting sort of middle class and bourgeois origins, that the conventional memoir and the conventional novel can, in some hands, be a way not to wrestle with the exigencies of contemporary life, but to offer maybe a useful refuge from it. There's that beautiful line of Samuel Johnson where he says, a work of literature can either allow us to escape existence or teach us how to endure existence, going back to Wayne's idea of different kinds of rapture. And, you know, I'm not right or wrong. I'm hugely interested in the latter rapture. I'm interested in a work that shows us how to endure existence. I'm weary unto death of works that only allow us to escape existence. As my friend Richard Nash says, the business of literature is to blow shit up.
Or as Gertrude Stein said, everything is ugly until it's suddenly beautiful. You know.
I agree with that, and I agree that I see a transformation in the genre of journalism, at least, but I'm not completely convinced that I see the cause of genre transformation in literature as being the precariousness of modern life. In fact, I would almost argue the opposite, that the precariousness of modern life, the scattered and distracting world we live in, has made people more and more desperate to retreat into the simplest, most rudimentary narrative structures. And you see that in the proliferation of genre fiction, but you also see it in politics. to a shocking degree, many of us this last election were stunned to realize that a huge proportion of the American population was more interested in living in a badly written fiction than in reality. And now we're in this strange war between pulp fiction, the pulp fiction of one camp, and the weak weapons of truth and rigor and analysis on the other hand.
Certainly not truth. I mean, truth with quotation marks, I hope. Not absolute truth.
Well, a devotion to the possibility of truth, the attempt to figure out what truth is, rather than simply espousing the most comforting idea.
Sure.
I just recently in my class taught Nabokov's Invitation to a Beheading, and it strikes me as relevant because in my reading of that book, which is about a sort of dissident imprisoned in a repressive society, Nabokov seems to be arguing that repressive government is essentially bad fiction. And that the cure to it is good fiction. The cure for it. It may not take down the government, but it will at least liberate the individual from buying into the false narrative. And the book not only sort of instructs its main character in how to read his life critically and his surroundings critically, it instructs the reader in the same thing. And Nabokov pulls off this amazing trick of writing a book that's about what it's like to live in a bad novel without actually writing a bad novel. So I think somehow we need to be better readers, as well as better writers of our world, experimental readers, dissident readers of a reality that no longer has very strong tethers in what we used to call facts.
Well, on that note, I will ask one last quick question, or maybe it's a request to ask you all to tell us about style and how it matters to you.
You're looking at style.
I know, I mean, I was like, Wayne can't go first, but.
Well,
Okay.
I would just say I'm always teaching and reading Gertrude Stein, so I'm thinking right now of Gertrude Stein, and what I want to say is that the stance of the voice saying the thing can be, it is not just the icing on the cake, it is the cake. It has the vessels of the deepest meanings of words and the sensations that we have in the world that makes us use language are present in the words on the page that often get derided as mere style, and in an experimental writer like Stein, who seems to jettison deeper meanings and to be only on the surface, there's this illusion that it's some kind of heretical act to dwell in those pleasures of surface, but it's, the words are the vessels of history, science, geology, words, the textures and sounds and nuances of words have tremendous vitality and concrete roles in this world as agents, and that's style.
Be blathering, but I was interviewed at some kind of event a few years ago in Wayne's hometown of San Jose. Did you go to San Jose?
Yeah.
I was at San Jose State University doing a talk, and a relatively well-respected editor and publisher was interviewing me. I'll allow him to remain nameless, although I'll share his name later for any. But he was asking me with a kind of impatience, like, don't you care about beauty? Don't you care about style? And I was like, I was furious. I was sort of, how dare you, sir? I care profoundly about beauty and style. I don't care about it in the terms that you would frame it. He's the editor of good books, but they're books that seem to me rather safe, rather comfortable, and style in a kind of received wisdom way. The only rule is never to be bored, as Kafka endlessly reminds us, how does the line go? A book should be an axe to break the frozen sea within us. That's style for me. That's beauty. I'm trying to think of someone who's thought to be a gorgeous stylist. It often feels to me completely DOA. It's just the kind of received wisdom of what constitutes beauty, or what constitutes style. Slippage constitute beauty and style for me. David Markson is the most page-turning writer I've ever read. Reading Markson is like reading an airport thriller to me. I am in absolute aesthetic bliss to read, say, Markson. That's absolutely stunningly beautiful style because it's extending the tradition. It's not safely beautiful with, whatever was thought to be beautiful in, say, an earlier generation. So for me, beauty and style are hugely married to understanding that art, like science, progresses, forms move forward.
I think style is integrity, in a way. And Dickinson said to Higginson, her correspondent, you think my gait spasmodic, I am in danger, sir. She was writing out of the deepest needs of herself, and the poem didn't sound smooth. She set off little bombs in her poems all the time. And that's part of what makes her poems what they are and gives them their style. Style has nothing to do with, as you say, beauty. Nothing. But I do think it has to do with necessity and integrity. And not showing off.
I'm not sure I understand what's wrong with showing off or beauty or even, the adjectives that are often thrown at purple prose, that it's masturbatory, that it's overwrought, decorative, merely anything. I think there's this barely concealed Puritanism behind the critique of the merely beautiful that we ought to examine more closely. But that said, I'm also in agreement that that style is what you get when you're fully engaged with your material. It's not superfluous. It is the stuff itself. And I think that for me, style functions, and sometimes even an excess of style, functions as a way of stopping the reader, slowing the reader down. You were talking about how Markson is a page turner. And I agree, but I'm actually interested in creating much slower reading experience. Not that I see any problem with Markson, but a lot of my time writing is spent on trying to bring the reader into such an intense and vivid experience of, well, as you said, a kind of local, a local intensity, a local phenomenon, to counteract the tendency that I think we all have, but maybe even more these days than we used to want to rush on to the next thing. I mean, I think one of the functions of literature for me is restoring the possibility of a kind of close attention that we, as we get older, for one thing, but perhaps also as we culturally accelerate, that we've sort of forgotten how to bend on the world around us. And that's one reason why I keep concocting these projects that take literature out of the pages of the book into a more public space. Like I have this other project, Snow, where I write out the words in snow and photograph them. I put them up on the internet so you can read them quite quickly on the internet as this series of photographs, but the real pleasure of that project for me is in the detail of the photographs, and even more the actual lived experience of fashioning these words, which each individually take at least half an hour. Mm-hmm. And I get very cold. One year I got pneumonia. And I've learned like the textures of different kinds of snows and how they're conducive to writing, and some are good for writing in because they're wet, and some are good because they're dry but thin in the right way. And there's this specificity to that experience that for me informs the text in a way that doesn't have anything to do with the way you might read genre fiction, for instance. I can't even say what it does to the story exactly, but that's what I'm interested in, is opening up the door to those kinds of those heightened experiences of the world, and bringing them into literature and bringing literature into them.